win. And I'll tell you the story in a moment. I very much appreciate, I should say, good morning to all of you, and very happy Sabbath, and it's delightful to see all of you. And I appreciate this opportunity to speak, I think. Mr. Simon asked me very nicely, and I think his exact words were, I'm putting together the first quarter speaking schedule, and if you're okay with it, I would like to put you down for a sermon. And then he said, no worries if you'd rather not. About right now, I'm wishing I'd have chosen the rather not. But you know how that goes. But no, it's always an opportunity to speak to God's people, and it's an awesome responsibility that we as speakers take very seriously, obviously. And also, it's an opportunity to teach and to speak to God's people always. A little bit of a comment about the weather. I know most of you think it's cold. And Beth and I, my wife Beth and I, are really enjoying our time here in the land of Goshen. And I have another story about that one time. I'll tell you, I think one of my pastors one time, I told him that Mr. Sinan said, you know, we left, we've been here a number of times over the years just for a Sabbath or two, and have gotten to know some of you and are looking very much forward to getting to know more of you as we go along. But I mentioned to one of my pastors one time that when we left, Mr. Sinan said, why would you want to leave the land of Goshen? And he said, you tell Mr. Sinan it's too close to Egypt. So he claims he didn't say that to me, but I don't think I would come up with that on my own. But anyway, the weather, you know, most of you think it's cold. My wife was having a conversation with our daughter. We're from Ohio, of course. She was having a conversation with our daughter, Monday, Tuesday, whenever it was. And her and her husband went out for a walk that morning, and it was 3 degrees. So that's cold. Here, we're just a little chilly. So that's what we keep thinking. We're just a little bit chilly. Mr. Johnson, that's Mr. Doug Johnson, who's our pastor, called me the other night, Thursday night I think it was, and he said, you know, he just wanted to touch base with me that, you know, they're expecting maybe upwards of 13 inches of snow in Cleveland and 5 to 7 over in the Youngstown area. And he just wondered, you know, what my thoughts were on possibly canceling services. I said, well, the roads are just fine here. So, anyway, I don't know if they ended up or not. As of this morning, we got a note last night, as of this morning, when we left, they hadn't canceled services yet. Well, some years ago, I took what was scheduled to be a one-day business trip. Now, I traveled quite a bit in my time. I had a sales job and did quite a bit of traveling. And so I had myself scheduled to travel to Lincoln, Nebraska, and back on the same day. And I had about an hour and a half. Now, Lincoln, Nebraska is not the easiest place to get to in the world, but I had about an hour and a half layover scheduled in Chicago. And so all of you know the story, right? You're gonna be ahead of me on this story. My flight left, it was early in the morning. You know, my flight left Cleveland about a half hour late. And then when we got to the tarmac in Chicago, we were delayed a little bit. And I got off the plane, and of course, my connecting flight was in another terminal. It's clear at the end of the terminal. And if you know Chicago, and many of you do, I'm sure, I ran. Literally, ran for about an hour. And I got there, and they had just closed the door. And you know, and it's happened to me several times over the years, once just about a year or so ago, once they close that door, it's over. They don't open it back up for you. The plane was sitting there. I could see it. All they had to do is open the door and let me in, but they don't. They don't open that door back up. So I'm trying to figure out how to get to Lincoln, Nebraska, and the best they could do was to get me in there at, I don't know, 4:30 in the afternoon, I think, through Minneapolis or whatever it was. So here I was. I had no bags, no clothes, nothing. I was planning to go out and back on the same day, and I did not have anything with me. And I couldn't get to Lincoln. So long story short, I ended up renting a car and staying with some friends in the Milwaukee area and washing my clothes and going to Lincoln the next day. But this all happened because of one little thing. My flight leaving Cleveland a half hour late. A half hour late. The point, of course, of it is that little things matter. That's the title of the sermon today. Little things matter. Mr. Franks, in Mr. Hafley's retirement weekend sermon, mentioned that. He mentioned in regard to the anniversary in Eugene, Oregon, that he attended, I think, a week or two before that anniversary. And that anniversary, by the way, was very nicely done. Beth and I really enjoyed the opportunity to be here for that, and it was very well done. And we really appreciate, as Mr. Simon mentioned, his effort and everybody's effort, because it was very nicely done. But as he mentioned, regarding the 90th anniversary, when only 23 people were present back there in the early 1930s, one of his comments that I noted was, little things make a difference down the road. Little things make a huge difference down the road. And they do. Now, you know, a half hour in a person's life, there are 73 years is the average lifespan for us, I think. And so I look to get there sooner than later, and hope for a few extras, as many of us have been fortunate enough to experience. But in the overall scope of it, the 640,000 hours that are in 73 years, a half hour is not very much. It's just a little, very little part of our life. But it can make a big difference when we miss a plane, can't it? Or when, in a lot of ways, as we heard about time in the sermonette today, a lot of ways it can make a big difference. Little things. I had intended today to wear a white shirt, but I took 3 things to the cleaners, 2 came back. And not one of them was not my white shirt. Now to be fair, they called me at 9 o'clock this morning when I was just ready to leave the house and said they had found it, which is a good thing, but not in time for me to wear it today, obviously. But little things, that's just a little thing in the overall scope of things. Just a little thing. Little things can make a huge difference, as Mr. Frank said. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25. I've got to make sure I keep an eye on the clock. Matthew 25. and verse 14. And, of course, you're well familiar with the parable of the talents. Matthew 25, verse 14 says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one of them he gave 5 talents. To another he gave 2, and to another he gave 1, to each one according to his own ability. And immediately he went on his journey." Then verse 16, "He who had received 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5 talents. And likewise he who had received 2 gained 2 more also. And he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. And after a long time," verse 19, "the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, 'Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I have gained 5 talents besides them.' Verse 21, his Lord said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant.'" Drop down now to verse 22. It says, "He also who received 2 talents came and said, 'Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. Look, I have gained 2 more talents besides them.' And his Lord," verse 23, "said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant.'" Verse 24 says, "Then he who had received 1 talent came and said, 'Lord, you know, or I know rather, that you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours.' But his Lord answered and said to him, 'You wicked and lazy servant,'" verse 26, "you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. Therefore take from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. So we can see here this principle in being faithful over a few things, over little things, faithful in the small or little or few things. And we can see in verses 24 through 30, as we read there, verse 30 says, and cast the unprofitable servant into outer darkness, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So we can see that it's important, the importance of being faithful in a few, in the little things in our lives. Luke chapter 16 builds on this principle a little bit. Luke chapter 16 and verse 10. It's important for us to be faithful in the little things. Many little things come up in our lives, don't they? Every day we have decisions to make. We make numerous decisions. And some of them are what we can deem as insignificant. You know, that little phone call we might make, or praying for someone. We can deem them sometimes as insignificant, small, little things that can make a big difference. You know, Mr. Simon mentioned in the announcement that God's arm is not short when it comes to praying for someone. Insignificant sometimes, or little, not insignificant I shouldn't say, but little things that can make a huge difference in the life of someone. Luke chapter 16 and verse 10 says, Christ here said, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. It's a very important principle. Little things matter. Little things matter, both for the faithful and for the unjust. Let's take a look at a biblical example of that, and we'll get into some personal things that we can do. Let's take a look at a biblical example. Let's go back to 1 Samuel chapter 15 and look at the example here of Saul. 1 Samuel chapter 15, and we'll start here in verse 1 and 2. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 1 says, Samuel said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore, heed the words of the Lord. Heed the words of the Lord. So here's the first instruction for you, Saul. Verse 2. Here's the first thing that I'm going to ask, that God is asking you to do. It says, thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. So here's your first instruction, Saul. Do this. Now, let's hold our place there. You might put a 3x5 card or something in there because we're going to come back to 1 Samuel. But let's look at and understand a little bit about this story, about, Amalek ambushing Israel on the way to Egypt, or on the way when they came up from Egypt, as it's put here in 1 Samuel 15:2. Let's turn back, if we hold our place there, to Deuteronomy chapter 25 and see that story a little bit. Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 17 and 18. Deuteronomy 25 and verse 17 says, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt. Remember that. Remember that. It says, verse 18 says, how he met you on the way and attacked you from the rear ranks. Attacked you from the rear ranks, all the stragglers at the rear, when you were tired and weary and did not fear God. That's what Amalek did, of course. It says that they attacked the rear ranks. The stragglers, who would have been, they didn't attack the warriors at the front of the line. They attacked the rear flanks, it says. They attacked from the rear where the stragglers were. Probably the elderly, probably the women and children, the defenseless. That's where they were. The stragglers, it says in verse 18. That's what they did to you. And that's what was referred to there in 1 Samuel chapter 15. What they did, what Amalek did. Verse 19 says, therefore it shall be, when the Lord your God has given you rest from your enemies all around in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, that you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. So they were told in verse 17 to remember what Amalek did. And in verse 19 it ends with a you shall not forget. So you had these people who attacked the rear flank. Sounds familiar to this day, doesn't it? Sounds familiar with what some of the things that have happened in the Middle East. Exodus chapter 17 sheds just a little bit more light on this story. Exodus chapter 17, and we'll read in verse 14. Exodus chapter 17 and verse 14 says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua.'" So I want you to remember what we read there in Deuteronomy chapter 26. Remember, do not forget. And here it says in verse 14 that it was to be written as a memorial in a book and recounted in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. The Moffat translation, one of the older translations that we sometimes use, said, "Write this down in a book," said the Eternal to Moses, "in commemoration of the day, and read it aloud to Joshua, for I mean to blot out Amalek from the very memory of men." God said, I mean to do this. And as we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 15, now I might mention that one of the best explanations I've heard on this particular verse is from Mr. David Register. Some of you may have listened to his sermon. I don't know. He had a sermon online, or there is a sermon online actually, right after the feast that he gave on Amalek. It's a very interesting sermon if you have an opportunity to listen to it, or if maybe some of you again have. I know that it was one that was going around some, but he described it. He said, God said here, because they attacked you, I'm going to supply a time in the future for you to wipe these people off the face of the earth. When that time comes, if you don't, you will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. We can read that in verse 16. It says, "For he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." That's again back in Exodus chapter 17 and verse 16. So that's kind of the backstory. If we go back now to 1 Samuel chapter 15, that's kind of the backstory to verse 2, where God said, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel when he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. That's the backstory to it. So the first instruction God gave to Saul here in verse 3 says, "Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man, woman, infant, nursing child, ox, and sheep, camel, and donkey." Wipe everything out. Now, sometimes we can read, and some people do read some of these things, and it appears, a bit harsh, maybe, to wipe everybody out. We think in our culture today how that goes over. To wipe everybody out. Mr. Meeker had a recent Life, Hope, and Truth Presents on, the question was, is the Bible hate speech? And sometimes these type of things are what are used to make that claim. And Mr. Meeker did a wonderful job of explaining that. One of the things that Dr. Levy did in one of his FI classes, I've tried to I think it's in Genesis somewhere, when he went through Genesis, and I've tried to find that, and I haven't been able to locate his statement, but he said something to the effect that we shouldn't get too hung up on some of these things when God opened up and 30,000 people died. Because God has a different perspective on those things. God can raise those people right back to life. We can't, of course, and so that sometimes can be our perspective, but it's not. God has a reason for doing these things. So when he says, wipe them all out, there's a good reason for it. God wouldn't do that without purpose and without reason, and he can, of course, again, just at the appropriate time, raise them back to life. So, of course, it says here that Saul was to take care of that and to destroy everything. So Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, go, depart, get down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them, for you showed kindness to the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. So he gave them an opportunity. He said, go on, get out of here, because this is going to happen. And Saul attacked the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He also took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, verse 9, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them, but everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. So Saul did what he was told partially, didn't he? He didn't do everything that he was told, did he? Didn't do everything that he was told. Now verse 10 says, now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. Now, if we go back up there to verse 1, it says at the end of verse 1, heed the voice of the words of the Lord. Do what you're told to do. Mr. Johnson, our pastor, often says that to us. And he said one of the expressions he has is something he said somebody taught him when he was training, is that in times of crisis, find out what your job is and do it. Here, Saul had a job to do. Verse 1 says, heed the voice of the words of the Lord. Let's drop down on now to verse 12. It says, so when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, he told Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel and indeed set up a monument for himself. He has gone on around, passed by, and gone down to Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, blessed are you, O Lord, I have performed the commandment of the Lord. But Samuel said, what then is this bleating of the sheep in the ears and the lowering of the oxen that I hear? No, you didn't. You didn't follow verse 1. You didn't heed the voice of the words of the Lord. What then is this bleating of the sheep and this lowering of the oxen? Verse 16, and Samuel said to Saul, let's read verse 15, and they brought them from the Amalekites. Verse 15, and Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Be quiet. I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night." And he said, "Speak on." So Samuel said, verse 17, "When you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel, and did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, 'Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then," verse 19, "did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord?" Let's drop down to verse 22. So Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrificing as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of the rams. For the rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry," verse 23. "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." And then we of course know and can go through the rest of the story. And we know what happened. Back to verse 20. Verse 20 says, "And Saul said to Samuel, but I have obeyed the voice of the Lord and gone on a mission on which the Lord sent me and brought back Agag, king of the Amalekites. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites." Now, was that a true statement? Was that a true statement? Now, in the overall scope of things, this story is not a huge event in human history. But it is one of those things, one of those few things, one of those small things, one of those little things that have made a huge difference from generation to generation. Saul did not do what God had intended to be done. He did not utterly destroy. Let's go to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 1. And read the story of ultimately Saul's demise, but also look at who brought the message to David. This happened now, again, this happened 40 years later. 40 years later. Now Saul, in 1 Samuel 15, verse 20, said, "I have utterly destroyed," except I've got Agag here. And of course, Samuel took care of Agag, as we know the story. But did Saul utterly destroy the Amalekites? Let's just see the story here in 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 8. Chapter 1, verse 1. So now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had stayed 2 days in Ziklag. Now there we see, again, he came from the slaughter of the Amalekites. So there were still Amalekites. So he did not fulfill 1 Samuel 15, verse 20. And on the third day, it happened that a man came from Saul's camp, and his clothes torn and dust on his head. So when he came to David, that he fell on the ground and prostrated himself. And David said to him, "Where have you come from?" So he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." Then David said to him, "How did the matter go? Tell me." And he answered, The people have fled from the battle. Many people are fallen and dead, and Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead also. So David said to the young man who told him, How do you know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead? Then the young man said to him, As I happened by chance to be on Mount Gilboa, there was Saul leaning on his spear, and indeed the chariots and the horsemen followed hard after him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called me and answered, and I answered, Here I am. And he said to me, Who are you? So I answered him, I am an Amalekite. So Saul, we'll stop the story right there, but Saul obviously didn't destroy the Amalekites. Saul was given a small in the overall scheme of things, instruction. The result was war from generation to generation. And we see that in the Middle East even to this day. Even to this day, that the effect of that decision in part, certainly, with all the things that go on in that part of the world even today as we speak. So Saul didn't fulfill his mission. A little thing, a small instruction in the overall scope of things, but not something that he fulfilled, did he? Little things can make a huge difference. Let's shift gears for the next few minutes and consider how little things can apply to us. How little things can apply to us. Let's go back to Genesis and set this up a little bit in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 24. The account, of course, of the creation in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 24 says, And then God said, Let the earth bring forth the living creatures according to its kind, cattle, creeping things, the beast of the earth, each according to its kind. And so it was. And so it was. So God made everything after its kind. And in verse 26, it says, God said, Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God gave us as man a very unique and different ability, didn't he? He gave us dominion. God gave us dominion. Now, dominion means, according to the dictionary, it means the power over right, or the power or right of governing and controlling. So we have dominion. We have the ability to govern and control. Webster adds power to rule or ownership. So you and I have dominion, don't we? We have dominion. It's a very important thing that we have. We have dominion, the power to rule ourselves, the power to make the right decision at the moment of choice. We have the power to rule ourselves. We have authority over every minute of the day. We have that authority, that power. Romans chapter 6 and verse 14. Romans chapter 6 and verse 14. Paul makes an interesting but strong statement here. Romans chapter 6 and verse 14 says, For sin shall not have dominion over you. For you are not under law, but under grace. Now, it's not my purpose to explain what that means, under law and under grace. We know that that has to do with we're not under the penalty of the law if we're repentant of our sins. And God is very gracious to us. Mr. Black, I think it is, again, has an excellent message on Life, Hope, and Truth Presents on grace that he covers this a little bit. And also there are several articles on Life, Hope, and Truth website covering this. But the point I want to make is that sin shall not have dominion over you. It doesn't govern us, does it? It doesn't control us. That conversely, we can have dominion with God's help, of course. We can have dominion over sin, can't we? We can have dominion rather than having sin control us. We certainly have some ability to control that part of our life, don't we? That we have dominion over sin. We can have, it's not really a little thing, I guess, but it is something that in the overall scheme of things, we can have dominion over our lives, over every minute of our day. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 10:5, just reference that, I won't turn there for time, but Paul said that, we are to bring every thought into captivity. I find that, as you read through the Bible, there are a number of challenge verses that are challenging. And that's always one of them that I think is kind of challenging, because every is pretty inclusive and can be a challenge sometimes for us to bring every thought into captivity. Every little thing, every little thought into captivity. And yet Paul said there that we're to do that. We're to bring every thought into captivity. We're to have dominion, control, ownership of our thoughts. We're to have dominion and ownership over our thoughts. Faithful in a few things. Little things matter, don't they? Little things matter. Consider the 10 Commandments in regards to dominion that we exercise over little things. Consider the 10 Commandments. Here's a question I ask myself, and it was referenced in the sermonette a little bit. Does God get the best time of your day? Does God get the best time of your day? Sometimes, and I've been guilty of this, and I'm sure many of us have over the years, sometimes maybe he gets the leftover time. Sometimes, I know it's a little bit different when I'm retired, and I don't have the schedule. One of the things that I will tell you about retirement, for those of us who are retired, I always say for 50 years I was in a hurry. I was always getting to a meeting, getting to work, getting to a phone call, getting to an airplane, whatever the case might be. And now that I'm retired for the last 3 or 4 years, 4 years it'll be at the end of February. Wow. I'm not as much of a hurry anymore. I don't have, but I know it's a challenge for those of us who are, to get up in the morning and to make sure that, we get up in time to do our studies and to pray and do those things. It's a challenge sometimes. The question, we are, that first commandment, you shall have no, other gods before me. nothing ahead of me. Sometimes, you ask yourself the question, does God get the best of my day? And I ask myself that question many times over the years. Does God get the best part of my day? Does he get the best time of the day for me? Do I spend the appropriate time? The second commandment, you shall not make for yourself any carved image. In modern translation, they use the word idols. Don't have any idols. Now, none of us, probably carry a cross around our neck or at Christmas time we didn't have a nativity scene in our front yards, I'm sure. But there are other things that we can think about. Let's turn in regard to that to 1 Chronicles chapter 16. 1 Chronicles chapter 16. And verse 25 and 26. 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 25 says, "For the Lord is great and greatly to be praised. He is also to be feared above all gods." Verse 26, "For all the gods of the people are idols." The margin there says, worthless things. And I think that's a question we can ask ourselves. I ask myself sometimes, do I spend too much time on worthless things? Worthless things, idols perhaps, worthless things. Just a thought. We can evaluate our lives based on these things. Of course, the third commandment, of course, do we take God's name in vain? Sometimes we've got to think about that as well. Maybe use euphemisms like gosh and golly and geez. Those things are euphemisms, of course, same as, the old OMG. Unfortunately, comes across our social media platforms at times. What do we think of when we see that? Do we think of that? Sometimes we need to think of some of those little things that we can evaluate ourselves on. And of course, the fourth commandment is the Sabbath. We'll stop there today. Mr. Simon, of course, gave a wonderful sermon on the Sabbath last Sabbath, on the Sabbath, that we really appreciated. And there are many ways that we can take small things for granted regarding the Sabbath day. Well, brethren, small things in our lives, little things in our lives do matter, don't they? They do matter. And God is aware. So these small things in our lives, we can evaluate ourselves in small ways in regard to the Ten Commandments. We'll stop. We're not going to go over the rest of them. We can evaluate, maybe the sixth and seventh commandment in light of Matthew 5 and the spirit of the law. We can evaluate those things in our lives. Mr. Franks, another comment he made regarding little things, he said, little things at the time become something important over time. Little things at the time become something important over time. So little things in our lives do make a big difference. Let's turn finally to Matthew chapter 25 now. We're going to go, as I might say, back to the beginning. This is where we started the message today in terms of our first scripture that we read, Matthew chapter 25, and verse 21 and 23, that say exactly the same thing. Now, I have kind of abruptly stopped when I came to his Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. Well done, good and faithful servant. In the context of the little things in our lives, how are we doing? How do we do? Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. Faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of the Lord. Brethren, the small things, the little things in our lives matter, don't they? Little things in our lives matter. Let's make sure that we take care of the few things.